Mail came in at 11:47 p.m. on a Tuesday, and Sylvia Chen almost didn't read it. She had been standing at the floor-to-ceiling window of her 43rd floor office, a glass of water in one hand and a quarterly projection report in the other, when her phone buzzed against the desk. She ignored it. The Chicago skyline spread out below her like a circuit board, all cold light and perfect geometry, and she was trying to remember the last time she had eaten something that wasn't from a vending machine. The phone buzzed again. Then again. She set the report down. The message was from the security system at her home in Kenilworth, not from her housekeeper, not from her assistant, not from any of the 12 people whose calls she would have expected at this hour. It was an automated alert from the exterior camera mounted above the side gate. Motion detected. Timestamp 11:43 p.m. Sylvia opened the app. The footage was grainy in the way that night vision always is, everything rendered in pale green and shadow. But what she saw made her set her glass down very slowly, very carefully, on the edge of the desk. Her daughter was in the backyard. Chloe, who had not spoken a single word in 14 months, who spent most of her days sitting at the kitchen table drawing in silence, who flinched when strangers came too close, was standing on the back lawn in her pajamas, her arms raised above her head. And she was laughing. Not the polite, empty sounds Sylvia sometimes coaxed out of her with a cartoon or a funny face. This was real laughter, the kind that bends a child in half, the kind that comes from somewhere deep and involuntary and unguarded. Sylvia's hand was shaking so badly she almost dropped the phone. She tapped to widen the frame. There, crouched a few feet away from Chloe in the dark, was a man. He was on his knees in the grass, his hands held up in front of a small flashlight, and the shadows they threw on the back wall of the house were moving, shifting, bending, becoming the unmistakable shapes of animals. A rabbit, a bird in flight, something that might have been a deer. Sylvia didn't recognize him. She was in her car 11 minutes later. His name, she learned the next morning, was Ben Stafford. 41 years old. Single father. He had been hired 6 weeks earlier by her estate manager to fill a temporary groundskeeping position. The previous contractor had quit without notice, and someone had needed to be brought in quickly before the autumn garden work fell behind. Ben had shown up with references, a firm handshake, and the kind of quietness that people mistake for simple-mindedness when really it is something else entirely. Sylvia pulled his file herself. She sat at her kitchen counter at 6 in the morning with a cup of coffee going cold beside her, and read every page twice. He had a 7-year-old son named Miles who came with him to work on days the school was closed, sitting under the oak tree near the potting shed with a book or a handheld game while his father worked. Sylvia had seen the boy twice in passing and had thought nothing of it. Her housekeeper, Donna, had mentioned him once. Sweet kid, very well behaved, reads the whole time, and that had been the end of it. Sylvia had not known that Chloe had noticed Miles too. She had not known that the two of them had been meeting at the back fence for nearly a month. Miles on one side with a chapter book, Chloe on the other with her sketch pad, sitting in silence in a way that apparently suited both of them perfectly. She had not known that Ben had first discovered this arrangement 3 weeks ago when he came around the side of the house to trim the hedgerow and found his son asleep in the grass with Chloe's drawing of a fox laid across his chest like a blanket. She had not known any of it because no one had told her, and because she was almost never home before Chloe was asleep. The copy was completely cold before she closed the file. She didn't fire him. That had been her first instinct, the reaction of a woman who had spent 20 years learning to treat every unexpected variable as a threat. But she stopped herself. What she had seen on that camera footage was not a threat. What she had seen was her daughter, who had barely smiled in over a year, laughing so hard she had to put her hands on her knees. Instead, Sylvia did something she almost never did. She came home early. She told her assistant she had a dental appointment. She left the office at 3:15, sat in traffic for 40 minutes, and pulled into her own driveway at 4 o'clock like a stranger visiting someone else's house. Donna met her at the door with an expression that suggested this was, in fact, somewhat alarming. "Chloe's in the garden," Donna said carefully, "with Miles. Mr. Stafford is working on the side beds." Sylvia nodded and went through to the kitchen, where the window above the sink looked out over the back lawn. She stood there without turning any lights on and watched. Chloe and Miles were sitting cross-legged facing each other on the grass. Miles had a deck of cards and appeared to be teaching Chloe some kind of game, a game that required a great deal of hand-waving and pointing at cards, and apparently at least one rule that could only be explained by mime. Chloe was watching him with an expression Sylvia had not seen on her daughter's face in so long that it took her a moment to name it. Concentration, interest, presence. She was here, in a way she hadn't been in months. Sylvia stood at the window for a long time. Ben Stafford came around the corner of the house at some point, wheeling a barrow of mulch, and he stopped when he saw the children. He didn't interrupt them. He set the barrow down quietly, watched for a moment with something careful and knowing in his expression, and then went back to work. It was such a small thing, and it undid her completely. She introduced herself to him the following Saturday. She had planned to do it formally, in the kitchen, with Donna present, the way she handled most things, with structure and witnesses and an agenda. But what actually happened was that she walked outside with 2 mugs of coffee at 8 in the morning and found him sitting on the back steps eating a sandwich, and she sat down next to him without quite meaning to and handed him one of the mugs, and that was that. He looked at the mug, then at her. "Thank you," he said. "I wanted to ask about the shadow animals," she said, "the ones you were doing in the backyard." He didn't look surprised that she knew. He just nodded and wrapped both hands around the mug. "Miles goes through phases," he said. "Last year it was magic tricks. The year before that, origami. Right now it's shadow puppets." He paused. "He's been trying to teach them to Chloe for about 2 weeks. She's getting pretty good at the rabbit." Sylvia looked down at her coffee. "She hasn't talked in 14 months, she said. It came out more flat than she intended, more rehearsed. It was the sentence she had said to so many doctors and therapists and specialists that it had stopped sounding like grief and started sounding like a medical history. Ben was quiet for a moment. "I know," he said. "Miles told me. He said she talks with her hands instead, and that it's actually more interesting because you have to pay attention." Sylvia looked at him. "He's 7, she said. "He is," Ben agreed. "He also reads at a 10th grade level and has opinions about weather patterns, so." He shrugged slightly. "He's his own thing." It was, of all things, the first time Sylvia had laughed in recent memory. Not a polished boardroom laugh, a real one, small and surprised and slightly embarrassing. Ben looked at her with an expression she couldn't immediately categorize. She started coming home earlier. Not every day, but more often. Enough that Donna stopped looking alarmed and started leaving dinner for 3. Enough that Chloe began to register her presence in the garden as a given rather than a surprise, began sometimes to look up from her sketch pad and find her mother watching and not immediately look away again. One evening in late October, Sylvia came home to find Chloe sitting at the kitchen table with a piece of paper in front of her and Miles sitting beside her, his small hands moving to shadow shapes while Chloe drew them. A bear. A swan. A long-necked creature neither of them could identify but that Chloe clearly found very funny, judging by the way her shoulders were shaking. Sylvia stood in the doorway for a moment, unnoticed. Then Chloe looked up and saw her. And instead of going still, the way she usually did when she realized an adult was watching, instead of that particular shuddering of expression that had broken Sylvia's heart so many times she had stopped counting, Chloe held up the piece of paper, held it up and tilted her head in a way that meant, unmistakably, "Look what I made." Sylvia crossed the kitchen and looked at the drawing. It was the long-necked creature. It had been given enormous, friendly eyes and what appeared to be a small hat. "That," Sylvia said seriously, "is the best animal I have ever seen." Chloe's shoulders shook again. She pulled the paper back and added something to it, a second hat apparently because every good animal needed a spare, and then slid it across the table toward Miles, who accepted it with the gravity of someone receiving an important document. Ben was standing at the counter, she realized. He had been watching the whole time. "She wants you to have one too," he said quietly. Chloe was already pulling out a fresh sheet of paper. Sylvia sat down at the table, and the 4 of them stayed there until the drawing was done. She began asking questions about his life in the way she asked questions about everything, methodically, without quite announcing that she was doing it. He was from Rockford originally, moved to the area about 2 years ago. Before that, he had been a structural engineer, 15 years at a firm in the city, the kind of work that required precision and patience and the ability to hold an enormous amount of detail in your head at once. He had left, he said simply, when things changed. "What things?" she asked. "Circumstances," he said. It was the first time he'd been evasive, and she noticed it the way she noticed everything, cataloged it, filed it away, moved on. She found out the rest from Donna, who had found out from Miles, who apparently had no concept of information being private. Ben's wife had died 2 years ago. Her name had been Carla. She had been a pediatric nurse, which explained, Donna said, why Miles was the way he was, raised by two people who between them had a preternatural amount of patience and an inability to talk down to children. The way she died was the part that Donna told her last in a lowered voice, with the particular careful delivery of someone who knows they are carrying something heavy. A building collapse. Commercial construction site not far from downtown. A structural failure during a renovation project. An inspection had been signed off incorrectly, a load-bearing wall had been misidentified, and the section of the building where Carla had been meeting a contractor about a potential renovation to her clinic had come down in 40 seconds. Sylvia set her cup down. He was the engineer on the project? She asked. Donna shook her head. He was the one who flagged the problem, she said. 3 weeks before it happened, he submitted a formal report to his firm saying the renovation plan was unsafe. They overrode him, told him he was being overcautious, that the timeline was tight, that the client had already approved the plan. She paused. After the collapse, the firm's lawyers said the flag had never been filed, that there was no record of his objection. Sylvia was very still. How many people were in the building? She asked. Donna looked at the table. 11, she said. 4 survived. Sylvia was, among other things, the CEO of Ashbridge Capital, a private equity firm that had, in the past fiscal year, managed approximately $4 billion in assets and made several significant investments in the commercial real estate and construction sectors. She was also, as she discovered on a Thursday evening while eating takeout alone at her desk, one of the principal investors in the firm that had overridden Ben Stafford's safety report. The company was called Merit Group. She had been a passive investor for 7 years, brought in during an early growth round by her former partner, and she had never once been briefed on the details of individual project decisions. That was the arrangement. That was always the arrangement. You provided capital, you received returns, the operational decisions were not your concern. She sat for a long time looking at the investment portfolio on her screen. Then she called her head of compliance. He answered on the second ring, because people who work for Sylvia always answered on the second ring. I need the full history on Merit Group, she said. Every project file, every inspection record, every legal filing in the past 5 years, and I need you to find out what happened to an internal safety report submitted by an engineer named Ben Stafford approximately 2 years ago. There was a pause. Sylvia, he said carefully, that's going to attract attention. If the legal team gets wind that you're pulling. I know what it will attract, she said. Pull the files. She hung up. Outside the window, Chicago glittered in the dark like something that had no idea what was happening inside this building. It took 11 days. The files were worse than she had expected, not dramatically worse, not in ways that surprised her. She had been in finance long enough to recognize the shape of institutional self-protection, but worse in their specificity. The paper trail was meticulous in its gaps. Every document that might have corroborated Ben's report had been purged from the system. What remained was a clean, coherent narrative in which the collapse had been caused by a pre-existing structural defect, undetected and undetectable. His name appeared exactly once in the surviving documents, in a performance review filed 2 weeks after the collapse, citing a pattern of overcommunication and poor team integration. He had been let go 4 months later in what was recorded as a workforce reduction. Sylvia read it 3 times. Then she called her attorney. She didn't tell Ben what she was doing. That was a decision she revisited several times over the following weeks, and each time she came back to the same conclusion, telling him would either stop him from coming to the house, which she couldn't have, for Chloe's sake, she told herself. Only for Chloe's sake, or it would burden him with something he had already spent 2 years trying to set down. She watched him instead, watched him with Miles in the evenings when they stayed for dinner, which had started happening with a naturalness that no one had formally arranged. Watched the way he spoke to his son, not in the simplified syntax adults often use with children, but straight, like one person talking to another. Watch the way he watched Chloe with the same focused patience he gave to everything, the same willingness to wait. One evening she found him on the back steps helping Chloe with something. Chloe had a piece of string and was trying to make a figure, a cat's cradle or something like one, and her hands kept losing the configuration. Ben was guiding her hands with a kind of careful precision, repositioning her fingers without taking over, letting her feel where the tension needed to go. He looked up when he heard Sylvia come out. She asked me to help, he said. Slightly defensive, she noticed, as if he expected her to object. I can see that, she said, and sat down on the other side of Chloe. Chloe looked from one of them to the other and then, with tremendous concentration, looped the string correctly. The three of them looked at the figure. It was not quite a cat's cradle. It was not quite anything recognizable, but it held. "That's new," Ben said. Chloe held it up toward the porch light so the shadows fell through the string in angular shapes across her face, and she looked up at Sylvia with an expression that was utterly unguarded, entirely present, entirely there. And Sylvia thought, not for the first time, whoever made this man disappear had no idea what they were erasing. The board meeting was on a Wednesday. Sylvia had been at Ashbridge for 18 years. She had sat in this room for hundreds of meetings, had watched deals turn and relationships dissolve and positions shift with the particular fluid brutality of high finance. And she had learned very early that the worst thing you could do in this room was let anyone see where you were going before you arrived. She had 7 board members and a legal team of 4. She had also, in the past 11 days, retained an independent structural engineering firm, a forensic document analyst, and a lawyer whose specialty was institutional negligence, and whose reputation made most corporate general counsels visibly uncomfortable. She presented the merit findings for 42 minutes without stopping. There was a particular quality to the silence in the room by the end of it. Not the silence of disagreement, the silence of people who have just watched something they thought was invisible become extremely visible. Harold Wynne, who had brought the Merit investment to Ashbridge 7 years ago and who played golf with Merit's CEO, set his pen down very carefully. "Sylvia," he said, "what exactly are you proposing here?" "I'm proposing that Ashbridge divest from Merit entirely," she said. "That we cooperate fully with the state attorney's office in their review of the collapse, which I have already initiated contact with as of this morning, and that we provide full documentation to the families of the victims." She paused. "I'm also proposing that we establish a victims' compensation fund from Ashbridge's existing reserves, administered independently, starting with the 4 families who were never told the truth about what happened to their people." The room was extremely quiet. "That would represent," said Kevin Marsh from the end of the table, "a significant financial liability for the firm." "Yes," Sylvia said. "You understand that some investors will exit." "Yes." "The reputational exposure alone." "Kevin," she said, "I know what it costs. I ran the numbers myself." She looked around the table. "There was a man who tried to prevent this. He filed a report. He was told he was wrong, and then he was erased from the record. And then he spent the next 2 years wondering whether he should have fought harder while the company that destroyed his career continued to operate without consequence." She set her hands flat on the table. "I want to know which of you can sit in this room and tell me that's acceptable." Nobody said anything. Harold Wynne picked up his pen. "Put it back down." "What do you need from us?" he said. She told Ben on a Saturday morning. She had rehearsed it, not the words exactly, but the shape of it, the order. She'd thought about doing it formally with documents, the way she handled everything. She'd thought about having her attorney present. What actually happened was that Ben arrived at 7:30 to work on the side garden, and Sylvia was sitting on the back steps with 2 cups of coffee, and he stopped when he saw her expression and said, "What happened?" She told him. All of it, the investment, the files, the report with his name on it buried beneath 11 months of careful administrative erasure, the board meeting, the Attorney General's office, the fund. He didn't say anything for a very long time. He sat down on the steps beside her, not quite looking at her, and she watched him hold the mug the way he always did, both hands, like it was something that might need steadying. "The report existed," he said finally. "I always knew it existed. I just couldn't prove it." "It existed," she said. "We found the original timestamp in a backup server Merit's IT team apparently forgot to scrub. Your file number, your credentials, the full text." She paused. "You were right about everything." He was very still. "Carla died at 11:43 in the morning," he said. "I was in a mediation meeting at the firm, explaining again why I was wrong." He stopped. His jaw worked slightly. "Miles was in school. I didn't know until 2 o'clock. The school called because I wasn't answering my phone." Sylvia didn't say anything. Some things don't require a response. They just require a witness. After a while, Ben said, "What happens now?" "The AG's office takes over the investigation," she said. "Merit's leadership will be deposed. The board is cooperating. The fund." She stopped. "The compensation fund is real, Ben. It's not symbolic. It will be enough to matter for every family." He nodded slowly. Miles keeps asking me why we're still here, he said. I told him it's because I like the garden. He paused. I don't actually like the garden. Something opened in Sylvia's chest. Then why are you still here? She said. He turned and looked at her. Direct. Unhesitating. The same way he looked at everything when he decided to stop being careful. Because Chloe learned the rabbit, he said, and Miles learned to sit still, and He stopped. Started again. I hadn't eaten dinner with someone in 2 years before your housekeeper started setting a fourth place at the table. The October air was cold and very clear, and somewhere in the house Chloe was awake, because they could hear her moving, the particular small sound of her bare feet on the kitchen floor, the creak of the cabinet where the cereal was kept. In a moment, Sylvia knew Miles would ring the front doorbell because he always rang the front doorbell even though everyone always used the back, and Donna would open it and say something dry and affectionate, and the four of them would end up at the kitchen table the way they always did now, without anyone quite having decided that this was what they were doing. I'd like to have dinner with someone, Sylvia said. For a long time, ideally. Then looked at her for a moment. Then, quietly, he smiled. And inside the house, Chloe pushed open the back door and stood in the doorway in her pajamas with a bowl of cereal and her sketch pad, and looked at the two of them sitting on the steps in the cold morning light, and tilted her head in the way that meant she understood something. She sat down between them, pulled her knees up, and began to draw. I keep thinking about the moment Sylvia stood at that kitchen window in the dark, watching her daughter play cards with a boy she'd never met, and didn't say a word. Just watched. Because for the first time in a long time, there was nothing she needed to fix. That's the part that stays with me. We talk a lot about doing the right thing like it's always obvious, like integrity announces itself clearly in the moment of decision. But what Sylvia faced wasn't a clear-cut choice. It was the kind of situation where doing nothing would have been easy, where the paperwork would have kept her clean, where the investment had been passive and the distance had been real. Nobody was going to knock on her door and demand accountability. The machine had already done its job. The record had already been scrubbed. Ben Stafford had already been made to disappear. She chose to look anyway, and then she chose to act on what she saw. I think about what that requires. Not just the courage which people talk about constantly, but the honesty that has to come before the courage. The willingness to sit with a file at 6 in the morning and admit that your name is on something you didn't fully understand, and that not understanding is not the same as not being responsible. That's harder than it sounds. Most of us, when we find something uncomfortable, look for the exit. Sylvia looked for the backup server. That's a kind of moral clarity I find genuinely rare, not loudly virtuous, not performing accountability for an audience. Just a woman alone in her desk, asking herself what she actually believes and then doing the expensive thing. And Ben, I think about what it cost him to keep showing up, not just to the job, but to life in general. To wake up every morning knowing you were right, knowing you tried, knowing it didn't matter in the end because the institution was larger than your report and the timeline was tighter than your conscience. Most people don't survive that kind of thing intact. They either harden completely or they collapse. Ben did something else. He stayed soft in the places that mattered, with Miles, with Chloe, with the patience it took to crouch in the grass at night and make shadow animals for a little girl he barely knew, just because she seemed like she needed to laugh. That's not passivity. That's a particular kind of strength that doesn't get named enough. The ability to keep showing up with your whole self when the world has given you every reason to go through the motions instead. And then there's Chloe, 7 years old, not speaking, carrying something enormous in her small body, and still somehow sliding a drawing across a table toward a boy she didn't know, because something in her recognized that he was safe. Children understand things we spend our whole adult lives trying to relearn. They know that connection doesn't require explanation. That presence is its own language. What I take from this story is something I have to remind myself of regularly, that the things we ignore don't disappear. They just grow in the dark. The report Ben filed didn't stop existing because someone deleted the folder. The truth about what happened in that building didn't stop being true because Merritt's lawyers rewrote the timeline. And Chloe's grief didn't stop needing tending just because her mother was managing it from 43 floors up. Everything eventually surfaces. The only question is whether you're the one who brings it into the light or whether you wait until it finds its own way there, usually at a much higher cost to many more people. Sylvia chose to be the one, and it cost her, and she did it anyway. I think that's the whole thing, really. Not a formula, not a system, Just the decision made over and over to see clearly and act honestly and keep going, even when the keeping going is the hardest part.